Hello, everyone. Today, we'll talk about cloud and open source and why those are better together. Now, let me start by asking you, if you hear cloud and open source, what are you really thinking about? And if you've been following the press over the last year or two, you may have heard various statements out there, such as cloud is killing open source as we know it. Words like cloud vendors are strip mining open source, or just take and give nothing back to open source communities. And what number of companies had no choice but to abandon open source licenses in order to survive. Now, is that really so? In this presentation, we'll cover a variety of topics, but also we'll attempt to investigate those claims and also help you to take a pragmatic approach about using open source and the cloud together. But before that, let's review the history of the open source software and the open source movement briefly. I think few people realize what in the early days of modern computing, the software was actually open source, sort of. Open source term was not used at the time, but software and hardware were bundled, and the value was in the hardware, not software. The source code was shipped with the early software because a lot of folks who were adopting those early computing technologies were early adopters, and they really could help vendors to modify the code to fix bugs or add functionality they needed. And the changes were really openly shared according to academic principle of sharing the knowledge. Now, as computing evolved and developed in the 70s, we had IBM as a dominating player in this hardware and software ecosystem. And in US, there was an antitrust lawsuit against IBM. And one of the things they have done is unbundled software from hardware. That meant now, instead of buying the hardware and getting software free, you would be charged for software separately, and which would allow other vendors to create software and make some money on it. Another important thing which happened at the time is computer software became a copyrightable item. Right? It's hard to believe now, but before that, computer software was not on the list of things you could claim copyright for. So it was not protected from things like copying without permission and so on and so forth. With those two things, the multi-billion-dollar software industry was created, and proprietary software became a major class of intellectual properties. Now, as we fast forward to the late 80s and the early 90s, that is where you see the free software and later open source software core terms start to be used. Richard Stallman, showed on this picture, was one of the leaders of the romantic open source software, as I would call it, where open source software was seen mainly as a way to make the world a better place, right? Rather than, just to make a lot of money. And open source software, for one reason or another, proved to be quite successful model. So much what in 2000 we have no one but Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft at that time, compared Linux to cancer, right? Seeing, I guess, that as a threat to Microsoft. And I think that is in particular interesting to compare that to the situation now, roughly 20 years later, when Microsoft is going on open source, and then actually the same Linux is being the most widely adopted operating system on Azure, the Microsoft Cloud. Also, in 2000s, we have some of the big acquisitions. We have Sun to acquire MySQL for $1 billion. That was a phenomenal success for open source company, which showed what open source business models could scale. Because before that, Red Hat was pretty much the only kind of outlier and exception of a company which could do a real business in open source. The $1 billion, what took Sun to acquire MySQL, of course, now looks as a relatively small money than database companies of this day, such as public open source database companies of this day, such as Elastic and MongoDB, has a valuation of excess of $10 billion. I think the next important involvement was with open source value being understood by the business, and especially by the larger enterprise, and that created the open source approach, where a lot of businesses would see, hey, open source is great, and let's make sure we lead our companies, our IT teams, to make sure they use open source as a first choice. Of course, when you think about the business and the enterprises, the open source as idea was not why they would embrace open source. They would really think about the open source as a lower cost, short-term and long-term, as well as other competitive advantages. And indeed, open source software generally offers direct lower costs, as well as it really is the preference of many developers, especially the good ones, because the open source really provides you fantastic community, as well as ability to look inside, to learn and understand it, as well as to fix it if you need to, which proprietary software cannot offer. That leads to better productivity, faster innovation, and of course, as a purely cost-driven or cost issue, avoiding vendor lock-in, which open source software provides, is a wonderful benefit for a business. Now, of course, as open source get itself as a preferred way of preferred license for especially infrastructure software, we have a new generation of open source companies created. Those were not founders which had romantic ideals and say, hey, you know what, we'll just do the open source because that's good, because that's right, but because the open source is how you can make money. A lot of those founders went to venture capital and raised the money. And with that, we had this responsibility, first and foremost, to grow fast and provide the high returns, rather than all that romantic notions of being helpful to the world at large. Now, if you think about those fellows, they really took the attractive messaging the open source provide and mixed it with general business principles, right? Build monopoly, avoid commoditization, increase stickiness, build anti-competitive modes, and so on and so forth. And I think what is interesting, what those really tend to go in conflict in many cases with traditional kind of romantic open source software values on building together and sharing the fruits of the innovation. With that, number of not quite open source software was born. We have an open core, open source eventually, such as business source license. We have number of shared source licenses, or also many cloud vendors market their software as open source compatible, right? Using open or open source in the name, but not really providing all the open source value. And I think this is interesting what the benefits and drawbacks that provides. At one extent, from one side, we have really a lot higher pace of innovation we've had with that high level of investments, and that includes even truly open source software as well. But at the same time, this kind of open source software often does not provide all the values truly open source software provide. And even more, in certain cases, it confuses people, which may think that such bastardized open source is really the true open source and there is no difference. Let's switch to the 2010s. That is where we see a lot of the rise of the cloud. The AWS was founded 2006, but I think it's only in 2010 and later, which it really has become de facto standard and started to change the relationship with open source. Cloud and open source relationship is different because I think cloud brings unique challenges and opportunities for open source software. If you think about the opportunities, is cloud allows really people to deploy the infrastructure much faster and easier. And really that provides much easier access to technology you can potentially run the open source software at. And really cloud vendors simplifying the open source software make that much more adoption easier, and the open source communities may benefit from that. Though open source companies may not particularly so. Number of companies, MySQL included, has been relying on the GPL as a protection from somebody being able to just take their software, package it under commercial license and monetize it. But GPL doesn't protect you from being able to package software in a cloud because you do not distribute it. And that is how a number of open source businesses are being forced to evolve and rethink the approach to business. I think this is very interesting to compare two very different communities in this space. If you think, for example, PostgreSQL community, they have been very much embracing cloud vendors. You have Amazon, RDS, Postgres, Heroku, Google Cloud SQL, you name it. That is wonderful. That means now we have PostgreSQL community has an extra choice, which is easier and has a lower barrier to entry. Isn't that wonderful? That will grow community, and sure it does. If you think about MongoDB, for example, they have been very much concerned about those vendors and even change the license from open source AGPL to non-open source SSPL to ensure what Amazon cannot make their cake. Because obviously they are first and most concerned about MongoDB profitability, right, as a company, and then needs of community. Another thing to remember is these words. Martin Mikus, and if you don't know, Martin was a CEO of MySQL at the time it was sold to Sun Microsystem. And at the time, I actually worked at MySQL many years ago. And what he used to say is what open source is not a business model. Well, if open source is not the business model, what is it? Well, you can think about open source as a licensing model, as distribution model, even as a marketing model, but open source on its own doesn't really tell anything about how are you going to make money, right? So open source can be based around open source, but it is not open source itself. Now the cloud impact, as we see, is really forces the evolution of a business models, what companies developing open source used to use, right? The things like reliance on GPL and some of the service businesses, they do not really play very well with cloud or substantially disrupted to the cloud. But I think that is quite common in our industry, if you think too. I found one of the interesting comparison would be to compare that to the music industry, right? And if you remember, a couple of decades ago, the music industry was making money by selling cassettes and then CDs in the stores, right? That was the main revenue source for the industry, right? Fast forward, we transitioned from selling albums to single track downloads, and then more recently streaming. Yeah, sorry, I got a typo on the slide here. And that really forced a lot of changes in the music industry, right? And it's at one point in time, a lot of music artists were very concerned whether we will be able to make money in this new reality. But then as things adjusted, a lot of them embraced the new business model and can be quite successful. Another thing I think which is very interesting in the cloud is great rebundling. Remember I said what IBM unbundled software from hardware, right? Now we are bundling that back together. And what that happens, that means your software costs are pretty much invisible. And that means there is no more zero price effect, on which I think the open source have been really relied as one of the factors of its success, right? Because right now, if I go to the cloud vendor and if I spin up the instance, right? And that's, let's say, instance alone, I pay so many cents or dollars an hour. And if I spin it up with some proprietary software, it just will be slightly different price, right? It's not like, well, if I even have to go and spend a lot of money buying Oracle in addition to buying my server, or I just can go and use Postgres absolutely free of charge. Another thing which is different in the cloud is what the open source in the cloud tends to be much easier to use than do-it-yourself open source solution. And I think we are all suckers for that kind of simplicity. So with that, of course, many folks prefer to use the open source as packaged by the cloud vendors versus rolling your own. Now, with all of that overview, let's see what things we just have to accept, right? Because, well, they are going to happen. One, if you look at the major enterprises, major cloud vendors, they are focuses on maximizing their revenue and profits. And they will do that using all the tools or on their disposal, including leveraging the open source software in a way which is maximally attractive to them, right? I don't think that should be surprise to anyone what the folks are doing that. Frankly, even before the cloud, you could see a lot of vendors using open source for the advantage of and without giving much back. Think about a lot of devices which are being shipped, ranging from your wireless router to various other devices. Often would, just include bunch of Linux software, right? Proprietary device, including open source software that didn't have to pay anything back. So that is not a new problem. That is a different new take on the same problem. Another thing which I think is sobering to understand is that the cloud vendors, they have a huge economy of scale and cost advantages in many cases, and also upper hand on providing easy to use solutions and do that faster than you possibly can. Well, let me explain what that means. So let's say if you as a vendor want to build alternative to Amazon RDS, but it's still a third party. The first problem is, of course, what you do not have access to all the internal APIs. So it's hard to build a seamless integration as Amazon itself is able to do, right? You can only to use APIs they choose to give to you, and they may not give you as much as they're able to use themselves. The second thing is what their Amazon pricing their service, right? Their true cost is actually how much it costs them to run the hardware. But for you, if you're basing your cloud solution on the Amazon, you would have to pay their retail prices. Well, maybe some negotiated discount, right? That puts you in a significant disadvantage. Not to mention, of course, amount of resources they have in invest in those solutions. The next one, though, I think is quite interesting and a positive. So as commoditization stage happens, the open source software tends to catch up, right? What do I mean here? Well, if you think about every market, the first innovation happens quite fast, and then it's kind of slows down, and then you have things becoming commodity. Think about cars, for example, right? Cars as a powertrain and everything, well, let alone electric cars, right? Didn't change that dramatically in the last 5-10 years, right? Compare that to the pace of innovation in the cloud industry, for example. And at large extent, they are kind of commodity if you look at the self as ability to move people between their, stuff, right, between locations. Right, that is what we see as a commodity, and that means there is a wide solutions which can be used for a variety of needs. Let's look at some example what already happened in the industry. With operating systems, I think that is the most glaring example. I remember getting in the Linux space in early 2000s, late 90s, and Linux was a joke. Solaris guys, SPUX guys, and so they would laugh at Linux. Oh, that is a joke operating system, cannot even handle files more than 2 GB in size. But guess what? Now, 20 years later, Linux is absolutely dominant player, and it's really replaced other server-grade operating systems. If you look at the databases, of course, Oracle is still Oracle, but if you look at the new application being developed, we are finding the open source databases such as PostgreSQL are good enough for vast majority applications, and they are able to replace Oracle. In the cloud, we have started with a proprietary vendors such as Amazon, who built out a very powerful and diverse proprietary plans for them, but now it is being replaced by Kubernetes and cloud native ecosystem. And in this regard, we have I listed them from somewhere where we can see disruption is kind of almost complete. Kind of Linux is dominating player right now. open source databases are there, but I think the proprietary database still have entrenched in certain of cases. And the cloud is the newest technology, which is just still being disrupted. You can also think about this from this standpoint. Some of you may remember in 2000s, there was a lot of hype and a lot of development on ASP.NET, right? The platform from Microsoft offering you productivity and so on and so forth, right? Proprietary platform. Well, guess what, right? Now we have ecosystems for programming languages like a Python or Go and others have been developed good enough or offering their same, if not better, productivity, and it's open source programming languages platforms which are the most valuable. Now we have cloud, the fair proprietary platform, but at the same time we can see the open source platforms are catching up, especially. I think the Cloud Native Computing Foundation really deserves their the note here. And you can see where the Amazon value is saying, hey, you log in with a cloud vendor, we make it for you their easiest, frictionless, as long as you use our proprietary solution. The cloud native, they give you freedom to run anywhere, use open source, use on any cloud, using cloud as commodity, and have a choice of vendors. And actually what you can see probably from this menu, there is a lot of solutions which are operating under cloud native foundation umbrella, probably even more than Amazon Web Services. Many of them are not yet as mature, frictionless or easy to use as Amazon stuff, but it is getting there. Now, another thing I think is interesting with the cloud is this image, which I pulled on from archives, and that is how Amazon used to market their cloud in 2000s. They would compare cloud to electricity, saying, hey, we all buy electricity. We're not running our own generators. But I think what is interesting in electricity is it is utility, where depending on where you live, you either have it as a commodity and may have, you know, choice of vendors, or at least it's regulated as utilities. So the local monopoly cannot skin you alive, right? Well, with that, of course, when the cloud vendors pivoted and really said something like, well, we have now a proprietary electricity. So if you want to buy the TV set, it will only work if you buy electricity from us, right? Well, doesn't make much sense, does it? So a thing you should recognize here is that with the cloud, you actually have a choice how you are going to use it. You can really choose a way of serfdom, then you jump into all those proprietary cloud solution, or way of freedom, where you use cloud as commodity and really use the open source on the cloud. Now, I am focusing here on Kubernetes. That is de facto the most mature, most commonly used API. But actually, there are some other APIs which may exist, which you may use to avoid cloud lock-in. For example, Terraform is another technology I have seen people using quite successful. If you're using open source in this case, I think that also gives you advantage what you are avoiding vendor lock-in, and you have also opportunity to support the truly open source vendors and participate in so open source innovation yourself, as working on those projects and making them better and more suitable on your needs. Another thing to talk about cloud is cloud costs, right? There is a lot of discussions about how expensive cloud is really getting. And in many large enterprises, cloud costs are a lot growing a lot faster than revenue growth. And increasingly, the top level management starts to think how that can be contained. But even if you say, well, my cloud vendor is kind of nice and it's not very expensive, costs are not a problem for me right now, you should learn what is typically the enterprise playbook and how that can apply to the cloud. Typically, as you enter in the new market, you want to make sure your solution is no-brainer to choose, right? In a lot of cases, especially in modern venture capital funded markets, companies focus on growth, not profit. Then they create proprietary differentiation and ensure it is adopted as broadly as possible. And then this adoption happens and lock-in created, then you can focus on growing profits through price leverage, right? Well, basically extracting more money from the same customer. Another interesting thing to consider is this. A lot of the vendors we're working with, these are large private, public companies, and they really, to be in a good shape, they have a pressure to show substantial revenue growth year after year. In the early days, when you have a small portion of the market, you can just get more and more customers, right? You may actually even double number of customers you have or more every year. But the problem is, as you have essentially everybody using your solution, you cannot grow by growing number of customers. You have to satisfy your hunger by extracting more money from the customers, and that's the pain creates. Why I point that out is because the clouds are quickly reaching the saturation point. Almost everybody, at least in some countries, have already moved large portion of their workloads to the cloud, and there is not less and less kind of that a new business every year. Now we have an interesting a history lesson in this case. Now, many of us know Oracle as a company which really offers very expensive database and other stuff, and has a very sales team with very kind of sharp elbows. But that is not how Oracle has started. Oracle used to save its customers from IBM hardware lock in the mainframe computers. They were kind of good guys until they achieved substantial market dominance to start to exercise their price leverage and have situations where you have nowhere to run. Now, I already spoke also about their cloud vendors, which often use open source compatible as a reason why you can use their software. You have to understand how that term is really used and what that means. That is pretty much one-way compatibility. Or you can think about that as a Hotel California, and there's this kind of famous song where that is a place where you can easily check in, but it's very hard to check out, right? So clouds very much focus on very easy to move from the open source technologies you self-provision to the cloud, but not so much on making it easy to move back. Now, I believe what in the end, nobody wants to be the hostage. And if you can avoid the situation where you have a vendor lock-in, you should really do that. Okay, with that, let's talk about where we may be going from here. Now, one thing I think it's worth to note is what we should not fall in a single answer policy, right? It should not say, hey, you know what everybody in this world will coalesce on just one solution, which will see everybody. And we can see over time, in many cases, there are a number of solutions. Like think, for example, on desktop, right? Well, you know what? Many people run Windows on desktop, many run Macs, you know, some run Linux, right? And it doesn't seem like we will have one of those or some other player just completely wiping it off, right? Or think about, I don't know, Android versus iPhone in the marketplace and so on and so forth, right? In many cases, there is multiple solutions which will continue exist depending on what is valuable to use. Now, if you think about the cloud, I believe what will have a continued move to the cloud. I wouldn't say what will have all workloads move to the cloud. In many cases, it makes sense to keep workloads on-prem for a variety of reasons. I think especially interesting in this case is an edge computing, where people say, well, you know what, if you speak about some, you know, factories in remote areas and what's not, right, we just want them to be able to operate independently based on like network connection to some cloud and what's not, right, and that has a lot of value. I believe the cloud vendors will increasingly be pushed into the proprietary cloud solutions, because from their standpoint, they do not want to be commodity. You want them to be commodity, they don't. With that, really, if you think about suggestions cloud are going to be making is use as much of that unique proprietary solution as possible. At the same time, I think there is going to be continued grow powerful and useful, easy to use, cloud agnostic, both software, open source and proprietary solutions, right? This kind of area of multi-cloud, hybrid cloud is not open source. That is a very attractive business with a lot of a proprietary vendor also going out there. If you look at the open source, we can see multiple paths being explored. And I see where you're going to have a lot of vendors which are going to continue move toward that proprietary licenses for cloud defense. We probably will also have those folks try to redefine the term of open source, right? Like think about that attempt of MongoDB to make their non-open source proprietary license or open source license. Or there was also this interesting effort by Redis Labs to add the commons clause to the Apache license, right, to make it look, it's kind of almost as good as an open source. So far, I think those efforts has failed, but also I am worried what number of young developers may not really understand what true open source is all about, and there may be more of a kind of inflation of a term. At the same time, we also see some vendors which are doubling down on open source and really using that as a competitive advantage to polarize them compared to the other vendors. In this case, I think in particular, it is interesting of success, some foundation or community-driven open source. You know, think about some of the most famous open source projects, such as Linux, or Kubernetes, or PostgreSQL, I already mentioned. They are not controlled by the single vendor. And while there are a lot of vendors which are building proprietary solutions or variety semi-open source software around those, there is the strong core open source project which is being developed, and I think that trend will continue. So what is going to happen with cloud vendors and their support for open source. We have to understand those when it comes to the cloud, they support open source for strategic reasons, not for some ideological reasons because open source is great. I mentioned Microsoft already, right? I mean, where Microsoft has a strategy of Windows competing with Linux, right? Of course, it's kind of really made sense for them to call Linux cancer and do all the way things to restrict Linux adoption. Now, when the game is played in the cloud, right, and you are looking for Microsoft, right, and you are looking to get more workloads, it makes sense for them to support open source, right? And we can see that with either GitHub purchase / investment, right, or all other kind of really supporting the open source right now. Amazon is also very interesting in this case, right? You can see on one extent, we have some proprietary technologies like extending PostgreSQL, making PostgreSQL Aurora, and not releasing any changes, right? But at the same time, they have built open source projects such as Firecracker, or more recently, pick up a fight with Elastic, and their Elastic changed the license to non-open source. Amazon actually forked it as open source, right, and continued developed under open source license. Well, in all of those cases, you can see some strategic reasons to do the open source in some cases and not do it in others. And I don't think that is going to change, and we should expect that. So let me finish by simplifying that to some single takeaway. So if you think about the cloud, I believe for vast majority of workloads, cloud has won because it really have convenience, agility, gives us that easy button and removes a lot of friction. At the same time, I think more and more people recognizes what software vendor lock-in sucks, and it didn't became better in the cloud. It still sucks, and that is where the open source comes to the rescue, as it always did in the past. With that, that's all I have for you. Thank you.